We've started our recording. This is our second webinar today for the LSTA Improving Access to Information Grants. Thank you for coming again this afternoon, or this afternoon if it's your first time. Biz is going to discuss the more specific details about the special collections and local history priority. And her expertise in that is far beyond mine, so I just bow to Biz to do this. So we'll have Biz take over. If you have questions that end up sounding more like general application questions, I'll answer them in the chat.
Thank you all for joining us today. Karen, as she said, did a great presentation this morning on kind of the nitty-gritty about what you need to do for your proposal for this grant. Mine's going to focus much more on the digitization specific aspects of it. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Biz Gallo. I'm the statewide digitization initiatives coordinator here at the Library of Michigan. And my job is to help libraries and cultural memory institutions around the state digitize their collections, preserve them, and make them accessible. Let's see. I do have a little bit of kind of overview before I jump in. Today, I'm going to be talking about the grant requirements, crafting your proposal, and then some additional planning resources if you need them, in addition to the things that Karen talked about this morning. Some housekeeping. Again, this webinar is being recorded. It will be made available once it's been captioned. It should be about a week. I'm going to leave time for Q&A at the end, but if you have questions about what I'm talking about at the moment, feel free to drop them in the chat and I can pause and answer them then or accumulate them if it's part of something I'll address later. You can also reach out to us anytime between now and when these are due, which is May 31st at 5 p.m. Karen and I are happy to answer questions about, general questions about the grant or specific about your proposal. If you have any technical issues, feel free to drop it in the chat and reach out to us. We can help resolve them. And I'm also going to just drop in the chat the many additional resources that are available on our website. And give me one second. There we go. Okay, great. So starting off with grant requirements, again, they can be on a range of projects. This one is going to be for improving access that have a direct impact on users. So you're going to have to identify what your community is and communicate to us how your project is going to have an impact on that community. For this specific grant, we're really interested in projects that engage with local communities. This could be, preservation of local histories. This could be preserving experiences or identities. Some examples of what this might look like are, preservation or promotion of an existing collection, if this is something that you have but just aren't providing a lot of access to at the moment. It could be collaborating with a local history museum or society to bring together a themed collection in your area. Or it could be improving access to materials that you already have digitized and online, but you might be remediating metadata to either make it more accessible, more equitable, or to have it able to be included in the DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America. As Karen mentioned, it's a priority of IMLS to improve or develop new services for target populations. So consider that when you are crafting your proposal and look for ways to highlight how specific populations might be targeted with this project. So the grant has been broken down, the Improving Access to Information grant has been broken down into 3 tracks. I'm only going to be talking about the one track that's focused on local history or special collections. And in this local history track, there's a few different areas that your grant could apply. One is digitization of local or special collections. It could be preservation of one-of-a-kind collections or assessment and preservation planning for special collections, whether those are physical or digital. I'm going to be focusing today on the digitization of local and special collections, but if you have questions or you're interested in other aspects of this track, feel free to reach out to me and Karen. We're happy to kind of provide more resources or guidance on that. But this is specifically about the digitization component. before we go on any further, the one thing that this grant does not support is, or the one format rather, that this grant doesn't support is newspaper digitization. The Library of Michigan does support the Clark Historical Library's newspaper digitization grant, or the DigMish newspaper grant. So I'm happy to point you towards those resources, but that is not funded. So if you are really interested in that, this is probably not the best grant for you. All right, so I'm going to kind of start off with your requirements for the grant so you can address them in your grant proposal. And these are things that we're expecting you to address in your grant proposal. As Karen mentioned, any digitized content from this grant is required to be made available through the Digital Public Library of America. If you're not familiar with the DPLA, it is a metadata aggregator, meaning that it's not hosting collections, it is pulling metadata for other hosted collections to make it more searchable and discoverable. So you will still need to have a way of making your collections available online, whether through your own system, through a vendor system. The Library of Michigan also provides digital hosting through our ContentID instance for other organizations if you're interested in that. Um, I'm happy to reach out to you, and it's in the resources section of this presentation, which you'll all receive a copy of. If you already have a platform, I would just ensure that it is compatible with the DPLA. Most hosting or collections hosting platforms are, but if you have any questions about that or you're not sure what this is, I would highly recommend that you reach out to Richard Adler, who should also be on this call and can answer questions at the end if you have DPLA specific questions. But he can make sure that whatever you're using is compatible or talk to you about ways to migrate metadata. Yep. Oh, and he just dropped in his email address. So thank you, Rick. There's really minimum requirements for this. I know it might seem like a big lift, but we really just need a title, a right statement, preferably a standardized right statement, and then a link and a thumbnail. So it's really low bar. I know it might sound like a lot, but it's a really low bar to get over. Again, if you are applying for this grant, the first time we hear about your project or your collection shouldn't be when we're reviewing your grant application. I would really highly encourage you to reach out to me and Rick about your collections and just make sure that it's compatible or that you have infrastructure in place or that you're capable of getting infrastructure in place before you're awarded a grant. Um, Again, the content created by this grant or this track of the grant must be in digital form. So if you are planning on also having them microfilmed or your material microfilmed, that is fine, but it cannot only be microfilmed. You would also need to have a digital component. There is an option in this grant for metadata remediation. So if you wanted to update your metadata, remediate your metadata, make changes, you can definitely do that. You would just need to be able to provide the status of your collection as it is now, and then what you plan to do to remediate or update that metadata. Also, just make sure that you're aware that the DPLA uses a mods profile. You don't have to use mods. You can use Dublin Core. There are lots of crosswalks. Rick and his team are great and can help with that. It's just really good to know ahead of time so that you can have everything in place before you start a grant or before you start a project. So, you're not, trying to figure this out at the finish line. I'd also like to note that digitization is a really good time to implement a metadata remediation project because you'll be working closely with materials. It's a lot easier to do it at that time than to go back later. Last, just make sure that whatever you're using for your hosting platform, that the material is freely accessible. So it can't be something behind a paywall or a login, anything like that. So not only for the purposes of the grant, but also for the DPLA. In the grant, you're going to be asked to explain and justify your processes and procedures for the handling and digitization of the materials. We do provide guidance through the Library of Congress's collections care page, but the assumption is that you will have already assessed your material before this project. So you'll know, does anything need conservation? Does it need rehousing? Is there, anything that needs to be done ahead of time? And are you capable or are you able to hire a vendor that can properly manage and handle this material? So that's all part of kind of like the background that you'll need to do. Um, You'll need to explain which digitization standards you're going to be using. The FADGI guidelines are a really good place to start if you're not familiar with file formats, or any of the type of technical specifications that go into digitization projects. Can also provide you with resources or consult to make sure that you're picking the right um, technical specifications for your specific project, because it's really not a one size fits all. So we're going to expect that you're going to know what you're digitizing to and kind of provide some explanation for how you came up with this. Like, why did you choose that resolution or that file format? Um, and then we'll also be talking a lot about or asking you to explain, what your workflow is, how you're going to create files, how you're going to do quality control, and what kind of parameters are in place. Are you going to be digitizing in-house or using a vendor? Um, if your project has any text, are you going to be doing optical character recognition, OCR, or are you going to have them transcribed? Just kind of a hint that if you're planning on doing anything with text, we're really going to expect you to include transcription, or OCR to make sure that it's accessible to users. Um, Again, touching back, talk about what metadata standard you're planning on using or you're already using, how you're going to be applying metadata throughout this project. Um, there's really minimum things that we require if you're going to be contributing to the DPLA, but it's always better to have more metadata. I mean, not excessive amounts of metadata, but enough that your collections have context for people who discover it, as well as enough information that people can find what they're looking for. So, title dates, creator. You'll also need a lot of this information for your copyright assessment. So just kind of consider when you're choosing materials for digitization or you're looking into materials that you might digitize in this project, how much intellectual control do you have over this material? And are you able to utilize that when you're applying for the grant? Like, do you know what you have? Um, excuse me. Do you know what you have and can you digitize it? Um, Kind of talked about this in the last slide a little bit, but just want to go over that you can use this grant to either digitize materials in-house, or you could use the grant funding to hire a vendor. It can go either way, and depending on your size of organization, the size and scope of the project, you might do one or the other or a combination of both. Things that you want to consider are, do you already have equipment in-house, or would you need to purchase it? Would you use grant funds to purchase it? Digitization equipment can be expensive, not just the initial purchase, but maintaining it. So if you purchase really expensive equipment for this project, or you hope to, um, we would hope that in your sustainability plan, you would discuss that you're going to keep it up in some way. Like, how are you going to maintain this equipment over time? Are you going to fund a maintenance contract, or you have a plan in place? So just kind of consider about that. Determine whether or not your staff has the expertise necessary to digitize the material. And if they don't already have that expertise, can they get it? The vendors usually have that expertise, but then once the project's over, you don't have access to that expertise anymore. So there's definitely some decision making to be made. Um, Also consider whether your staff has time to digitize the project. Even if you're not paying a vendor to do, or even if you're paying a vendor to do the digitization work, there's still a lot of upfront costs and project management costs that go into this. Preparing material, pulling it, describing it, quality control on the other end, making sure that what the vendor gave you is what you asked for, and all of that custodial work that you do after the digitization is done. It's a portion of the project, not the whole project. So even if you are using a vendor, you'll need to talk about how you'll manage the project. Also consider how much control you want over the process. So when you're working with a vendor, it's sort of that black box model where you don't know what happens and you're trusting that the vendor is doing what they're saying they're doing. It's why it's important to vet your vendors. And I can provide resources on how to vet and select vendors if you are interested in going that route. Um, in the end, it depends on your own organization, what your resources are, what's going to be the most cost effective, and what's going to fit within your own organization's comfort level. Um, so looking at this, we're going to ask you to explain what your needs are and how you came to that conclusion. It's like what your equipment needs are if you're going to digitize in-house. So we'll expect you to list a scanner, computers, possibly external monitors, software, hard drives, all the kind of accoutrement that go with that, not just I need a flatbed scanner or I need a digital camera. Consider why you chose specific equipment. Um, does your staff have the knowledge and expertise to use this equipment if it's new? And how are they going to get that? If you are outsourcing and using a vendor, I would highly encourage that you include a justification for not only why you chose a vendor, but why you chose that specific vendor. Ideally, you will be getting quotes from 2 to 3 qualified vendors, and checking their references. Hopefully, you will ask for references for similar size projects and institutions to your own, because what might work really well for a large institution might not work well for yours, vice versa. I would also recommend that you include the quote, at least the quote of the vendor that you choose to go with in your proposal as an appendix. Um, you could provide all of them and say which one you chose, but I would say at the very least, include the vendor that you are selecting to work with. Also, don't wait for the last minute to ask for quotes from your vendors, depending on the time of year. I mean, this isn't a super busy time of year for a lot of vendors, but they might not be able to turn something around really quickly. Um, yeah, I will say I was working with a library who had applied for a different grant and did not get it. And when we were looking over feedback and looking over their vendor quotes, it was really clear why they weren't awarded the grant. And based on what vendor quotes they had received, it was clear that none of the vendors would have been able to do the project as it needed to be done. So the grant reviewers knew that that was not a good investment of grant funds. All right. So we talked a little bit about the digital access component of what would be needed for your files for this project. You'll need to include in your grant proposal a digital access / hosting plan. We don't really care what system you use as long as we have access to it. Not we, the library, but public has access to it. Want to make sure that you know that digital hosting online is not the same as digital preservation. You will need to have a digital preservation plan to meet the sustainability guidelines of the grant. So you'll need to address both access and preservation in your application in order to be successful. We'll need you to explain how you estimated the amount of storage you needed and how it was determined. And you know, not only for the preservation, but for the access as well. I also want to talk a little bit about the Michigan Digital Preservation Network. Um, I think Chelsea Denault is the coordinator for that, and she is on the call as well to answer questions later if you have any about this program. And there's her contact information in the chat. It's also going to be in the resources documentation, but the Michigan Digital Preservation Network, which I'll talk about in a minute, there is a fee for this. There is not for the DPLA, but if you are awarded a Improving Access to Information grant, then um, you will get an annual membership if you're not already a member included as a grantee, and whatever files are generated over the course of the grant work, you'll get free storage for those for the grant period. So it's a good introduction to a large scale digital preservation infrastructure. Um, and those costs are integrated into the project, so you don't have to worry about that, at least for the initial stage. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But regardless of whether you use the Michigan Digital Preservation Network or you have your own digital preservation plan in place, we'll ask you to describe that, whether it's cloud server backups, you've got microfilm backups, you've got hard drives, whatever it is, we just want to know so that we know that you have a plan in place. It's really important um, that you have staff and resources committed to the long-term preservation of whatever files are created during the grant cycle. Then this is just a little bit of information. So you have it about the MDPN. It's a collaborative digital preservation provider. It's something that the Library of Michigan supports, as well as other organizations throughout the state. They use a lock software. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. Got nodes around the state. It is a fairly inexpensive membership, just depends on the size of your organization, and then additional storage costs. So there's some information about that. Karen mentioned this in the earlier presentation, but I will go over it a little bit more detail now. The digitization proposals are required to provide documentation on copyright permission from either the copyright holder or documentation that the content is in the public domain. And that's for all materials in the proposal. This is something that we're really strict about. There is a spreadsheet that is in all of the documents for the proposal section that you would need to fill out and provide either item level or group level statements for the copyright status. Um, you know, intellectual control of material is not the same as physical control. So just because you have it in your collection doesn't mean that you have the intellectual rights to that material. So you would need to, either demonstrate that it is in the public domain based on either when it was published, or when it was created, or if it is still under copyright, you would need explicit permission that I would ask you to attach as an appendix from the copyright holder. There are lots of tools to help you determine the copyright status of a particular work. I can help you determine that or point you to resources to help you determine that. We highly also recommend that you use standardized rights statements to remove a lot of the ambiguity that comes with copyright and how people can use material. The spreadsheet that is included as part of the application packet relies on standardized rights statements. Again, you don't have to, but it is highly recommended. So there's a section for you to list the material, list its copyright status, and then also you'll need to explain how you determine that. So just a statement that says all of this is in the public domain is insufficient. If you say this collection was, for material published in 1912, and because it's pre-1929, it's in the public domain, that's sufficient. So you don't have to do item by item if the entire body of work that you're going to be digitizing under the grant falls within that category. If you're digitizing or planning to digitize a variety of material, you may have to do a little bit more item by item. And if you have questions about that, we can go through that spreadsheet together. We can address that. Has anyone not been able to go through the spreadsheet, or have you downloaded things and you've kind of peeked at them? This makes sense for the spreadsheet. or at least you saw the spreadsheet. Don't forget that there's a spreadsheet. It's a separate form that you have to do. Um, great. So again, the two types of materials that could be digitized in this project or under this grant project are material where it is still covered under copyright, but you have written permission from the copyright holder, or it's in the public domain. That's it. We're not going to, I mean, I understand that a lot of things may be orphaned works, but we're not going to be uh, digitizing those or covering those in the digitization grant right now. Excuse me. Talked a little bit about this earlier when you were doing an assessment of your collections to include in this grant. Just making sure that if you do require any sort of conservation work, or you have especially fragile or vulnerable materials, that you're considering that in your grant proposal. This is a really good time to incorporate rehousing or conservation work. The grant would cover that work, but we also want to ensure that you are accounting for how materials will be preserved after the digitization period is over. So, if these are materials that you might need to bring in a consultant to handle, or you might need to have mold remediation done, just be sure to include that in your proposal. Okay, any questions about the grant requirements before I move on? Okay, all right. Talk to us a little bit about crafting those are kind of the what's required, and then this section's talking more about what we're looking for in crafting a good proposal. So again, this is the improving access to information grant. So we really are looking for you to highlight how you are improving access to these collections. That is the focus. If you can't point that out easily, this probably isn't the right grant opportunity for you. The narrative should include all the budget items. So your budget is going to be a separate spreadsheet that lists what everything costs, but you should refer in your narrative to each one of those items and why you need to purchase that or contract those services. Make sure that you're writing for clarity and conciseness. We read a lot of these, and it really stands out when the people do a good job and keep it clear. And also be as specific as possible in each section. So if you're repeating information from a different section, you're probably not answering the question the right way, because they're all supposed to only have sort of one answer one time you're going over that information. When you're talking about a digitization project plan, I always like to kind of use SMART as the acronym. It should be specific, should be measurable, should be achievable, should be relevant, and it should be time-based. So if we look at what this means for a digitization project, in terms of being specific, you should be able to talk about specifically what you're going to digitize. So that's a number of items, the formats that you're going to digitize, the date range, the subjects in that material. Just saying, oh, we want to digitize our collection of local history materials is not specific enough. You we we want to know what's in the box. So we kind of like to use this, digitize an X number of object types from a certain date range about certain subjects. That's a lot more specific. That's going to help us know that you have some intellectual control over the materials that you're going to be digitizing or hope to be digitizing. So that way you've at least done an inventory and you know what you have. I think it'd be really hard for you to write a successful grant application without knowing this level of specificity. Measurable. We're always, especially with grant projects, wanting to measure success. In this specific grant, you'll need to provide both outcomes and outputs for the grant activities. There is a section in your grant applications that's dedicated to your evaluation plan. So when you're crafting your proposal, you should definitely be having these in mind. Outcomes and outputs are not the same thing. The goal for this grant is to improve, increase, and enable access to your local history materials. So we will want to see that you've thought about how you're going to measure that. Um, do people learn because they have access to the material now, or were they able to use content that they weren't able to use before because now you can use screen readers with it or something like that. You will have outputs as well, so looking at the number of items you digitize, the number of times things were accessed, page visits, those sorts of analytics that inform the outputs. But this grant is more concerned with the outcome. So keep that in mind as you're crafting this. It will need to be achievable. So I know with digitization, people just love to jump right into the digitization part, and I'm unpopular because I spend a lot of time asking people to stop and to kind of take a step back and think about what they're going to do with all of these files. So you could digitize a lot in a year, but can you digitize, describe, provide access to, and preserve material in a year? You just want to make sure that what you're proposing is achievable and something that you can deliver because as the grant reviewers are reading over your proposal, if you if you say that you're going to do a lot more than what's possible or likely possible in a year, we're going to think that you don't have a really good grasp on what's needed to do this project. I will say that, a year is not a lot of time. It might feel like a lot of time, but it's I'm already doing this this spiel again, and I feel like I was just doing it last year. So it goes by really quickly. We would much rather you underpromise and overdeliver than the other way around. We just want to make sure, especially if you haven't done a grant before or you haven't done a digitization project before, we would much rather you start small and say, or even if you have a multi-year project and you say, you know, we'd like to digitize this collection. We're hoping to break it up into 2 or 3 years, and we'll do the first section this year, and then we plan to apply for grants in future years to do the rest of the project. We would prefer that than you trying to digitize something that's going to be too large of scope. Make sure it's relevant. There is a section in the grant proposal where you identify your target population and their need for this and how you determined that there was a need for this. So you should be able to identify, who your audience is, how you determine the need, mm, and how this is relevant. And then also just make sure that you're linking those to the goals of IMLS and their objectives. Last is just make sure that whatever plan you have, it's time-based. Again, a year is not a whole lot of time, especially I know Karen mentioned it in the earlier webinar, but the the deadline for expenditures is August. So you only have 11 years or 11 years, 11 months to spend the money, not 12. So just make sure that if you are working with a vendor or you're purchasing services or anything like that, that they know not only what the grant deadlines are, but also your timelines so that they can incorporate that into their timelines and workflows. Always build in a buffer. Things happen. We know this. So give yourself, several weeks or a month of buffer for, especially if it's a larger project, so that if things do go wrong, you aren't left in a lurch. Excuse me. Last, just mentioning that you are eligible to work with partners on this if you would like. Karen talked in detail about what a partner is versus what a supporter is. If you are working with a partner, it has to be, you have to be the main applicant because you have to be from an LSTA eligible library. Excuse me. So examples of this would be in the past, public libraries have worked with their local historical societies to digitize materials and provide access to it. So it was the local history or the local historical societies material using library staff and workflows and infrastructure to provide access to it, and then you're able to provide access to a whole lot more content. So uh, it depends on if you already have relationships with your local organizations or potential partners. Um, I think it's a really great way to share resources and build community, but it just really depends on what you already have in place. All right, any questions before I move on to planning resources? There are a lot of planning resources. Again, you'll get a copy of the slides that have linked to these. All of these are also on the Library of Michigan digitization page, but just kind of going through these. If you're new to digitization or your staff might need some training, these are some training resources that are available through the Library of Michigan. We have a lot of resources on our digitization page. There's also a webinar series and digitization, excuse me, a digitization pathway in niche. And then we also have monthly office hours where Rick and Chelsea join me and we answer questions. So if you have questions, you can reach out to us at any time, but you can also come to drop-in office hours. If you are looking to plan for this project or any project really, you can use the Digitization Project Planning Guide. It's a really helpful step-by-step guide to kind of account for what your resources are, what your needs are, what your goals for the project are, and you can kind of document it. And so if you haven't done one of these before or you're new to digitization, this is a really great way to kind of plan out your materials. And then you could also, use it as an appendix to support your proposal if you wanted. If you're looking to purchase equipment, if you're looking to purchase equipment, but you don't know what to get, there's a digitization equipment selection matrix, which has a variety of different digitization equipment, and it compares them on a variety of different factors from cost to capabilities. And it's just a helpful guide if you don't know where to start. If you don't think you want to purchase equipment or you might want to borrow equipment, the Library of Michigan does offer equipment loans on two different models of scanners. They're free. I would say if you are planning to use them for the grant, to request or book them now or sooner, just in case you get the grant so that you have access to them, because there's a several month wait period on them. Just links to some standards and best practices for digitization in terms of technical specifications that you can check out, as well as materials handling. Talking a little bit about digital hosting. So again, the Library of Michigan does offer free digital collections hosting. It is not preservation storage, but it is collections hosting through our ContentID instance. If you want to find out more information about that, you can explore the LM Digital community. We do take care of all of the harvesting of metadata for the DPLA. There's also the contact information here for Rick Adler, and then there is a note, a section here for the Michigan Digital Preservation Network for digital preservation. So if we do host for you on LM Digital, that does not include preservation storage. So you might want to explore other options like the MDPN. And then here are some additional resources on identifying the copyright status of material in your collections. Obviously the U.S. Copyright Office, but if that's a little bit too confusing, because it is, Cornell has a really great resource on determining copyright terms in the public domain. The last resource I'll talk about is me and Karen. We are happy to review your proposal. It's not cheating. Please send it to us. We'll review it. We'll read it and tell you, you could strengthen this piece here, or this isn't allowed, or have you thought about including this additional equipment? Last year, we had somebody send us a draft, and we were able to point them towards a whole other kind of section of equipment that they hadn't considered that they would need to buy. So we saved them from having to get that out of pocket by including it in the grant. Um, Again, if you are planning on applying for this grant, the specific digitization grant, I really hope that the first time I hear about your project is not while I'm reading your proposal. It's we would love to fund digitization projects. We are just really hopeful that the applications show that you can execute a digitization grant. All right, that's it. That's kind of the thing. So I assume that there will be questions. I think Karen had to hop off actually, but I can answer a lot of the questions. If they're very grant administration specific, we might have to wait for Karen. But Rick and Chelsea are also here if you have questions about the DPLA or MDPN. So, oh, Karen is back. So never mind, we are all saved. Um, excuse me. But feel free to, unmute yourself, to drop questions in the chat. However you feel most comfortable, ask away. Or just like put in the chat what you're wanting to digitize. Yeah, hi Annie, go ahead.
Hey Biz. Um, so I have an idea for a project that's not so much a digitization project as it is improving access to an already digital collection. So we have a lot of oral history collections, as I'm sure you know, at GVSU. And one of our collections, there are a little over 100 interviews, video oral history interviews that don't have
Mhm,
transcripts. And it's a multilingual collection. So some of
mhm,
the interviews are in Spanish, some are in English, and some are in both English and Spanish. So I'm kind of interested in getting transcription translation done. And I was wondering if you have any um, resources regarding vendors for that kind of service that you could share. Because that's like the part that I'm kind of stuck on is like I have no idea who to turn to or if there are like um, trusted vendors or if I should just like Google it and pick one.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, of course. So Spiel, the Library of Michigan cannot endorse specific vendors, and each library should contact each vendor to find out whether their services are right for them. I can send you a list, though, of vendors that you might want to reach out to and contact for quotes, um, uh, and see which one might be the best option for your material. Things that you're going to want to know are the number and the approximate duration of those, which since they're already digital, you should be able to get that fairly easily. But I think that that would be a really good project for this grant because it is definitely improving access to that information. So that's really neat.
awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll follow up with an email with the list.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Any other questions? People have ideas for projects or they're thinking about projects? Donna, does this grant have the same limit on vendors not being on the government list? Yes. Karen, I assume that you're talking about that sort of foreign agent vendor. Um, you're muted.
If that's what you're referring to, Donna, that applies to all federal funds. Um, but it's related to manufacturers. So if it's a service provider, uh, you wouldn't need to check.
Yep. Right.
If anyone has any trouble figuring that out at some point, they can feel free to send me an email or call me about how to search sam.gov
Mhm.
because it used to be a lot easier and it's less so now.
And I will say that um, if you're using a service provider, then they do anything with uh, government entities, they also have to affirm that they are not using working with any of the manufacturers on that list. So they're used to it. They're used to it.
It's a cybersecurity issue.
Yeah. How many people are looking to digitize documents? You can just do like hand raise or +1. Heidi. Is this the one we talked about last year? Documents. Yay! Oh, I'm excited. And I will tell you, it's totally okay if this is your first time thinking about this project and you're like, wow, that's a lot of stuff that I have to do to apply for this digitization grant. I'm not ready. That's okay. It's okay to say, I'm going to spend the next, 6 months getting things in line, figuring out what I need to do, and then I'm going to apply for it next year. Like Heidi is doing with a project that we were looking at last year, and it just was not going to be ready in time. So I'm really excited about that. Again, if this is something where maybe you want to put in for a grant to do some sort of planning work for it. So doing a copyright assessment, like I have this material, but I just do not know what the copyright status is. Maybe you're going to put in to do that work and then apply for the digitization part in future grant cycles. So just sort of think outside the box for what your project is and what it might need to get there. It might not be straightforward. Documents, photographs, any AV, any three-dimensional objects? No? No. Oh, oh, those house keys. Oh, that's exciting. Okay. Well, I'll stay on for a while longer, but I just wanted to point out, again, Karen and I are here to answer questions through the end of May. Hopefully, hopefully if you are planning on applying for this grant, you're not going to reach out to us on May 30th and ask us to review your proposal. But I would say, a few days beforehand, up to a few days beforehand, we'd be happy to do that. Review, provide feedback. Again, it's not cheating. We would really love to help you be as prepared as possible to put in a good application. And thank you to IMLS for making this grant possible.
All right. We hope to hear from all of you.